November 1944. The Siegfried line, somewhere east of Aachen. Second platoon stopped moving, not because they were pinned, not because they were flanked. They just stopped. 41 men spread across a frozen hillside under direct machine gun fire, and not a single one of them took another step forward. Sergeant Warren Briggs was in the front. He turned around, screaming at his squad. "Move! Move up! We have to take that ridge!" Nobody moved. Private Tommy Farina, 19 years old, from Flatbush, Brooklyn, looked Briggs in the eye and said, "No." Not quietly, not under his breath. He said it loud enough that the men around him heard it, and when they heard it, something shifted. One man's refusal became permission for every man behind him. Within 30 seconds, the entire platoon was down, helmets in the mud, rifles at their sides, done. 300 yards ahead, German machine guns kept firing, chewing up the tree line above their heads. Behind them, Captain Lewis Mercer stood at the company command post, watching through binoculars. He saw it happen in real time, an entire platoon shutting down in the middle of an active assault. He put down the binoculars and said to his radio operator, "Get me battalion." What happened next went all the way to Patton, and what Patton did when he arrived changed the way those men understood the war, themselves, and the man who led them. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that go where others won't, into the moments when the bravest men alive couldn't take another step. To understand why 2nd Platoon stopped on that hillside, you have to understand what they'd been through in the weeks before. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, they'd been fighting since North Africa, Sicily, Omaha Beach, the hedgerows, the breakout at St. Lo, the race across France. By autumn 1944, they'd been in combat longer than almost any unit in the European theater. But the Hurtgen Forest broke them. They entered the Hurtgen in late October 1944. Command called it a clearing operation, push through the dense forest east of Aachen, secure the German flank, open a path to the Rhine. It was supposed to take a few weeks. It took months. And it was a catastrophe. The Hurtgen was a nightmare engineered by geography and German ingenuity. Dense evergreen forest, terrain so thick that maps were useless after 50 yards. The Germans had fortified every ridge, every ravine, every intersection of trail. They'd wired the trees with explosives, trip wires that detonated charges in the canopy, sending shrapnel and splintered wood raining down like wooden shrapnel. The Americans called them tree bursts. They were devastating. A man could survive a shell landing 10 feet away in open ground. A tree burst in the forest killed everyone within 30 yards. There was no cover. The trees themselves were the weapon. Fox Company went in with 187 men. After 12 days in the Hurtgen, they had 91. 96 casualties in less than 2 weeks. Not from a single battle. Not from one catastrophic engagement. Just a slow, relentless grinding. 2 men here, 5 men there, a patrol that went out and never came back, a position overrun in the night, a tree burst that caught a squad eating cold rations. The losses weren't dramatic. They were constant, and that was worse. Dramatic losses can be processed. A single devastating moment becomes a story, something the mind can frame and contain. Constant losses are different. They erode something fundamental, the belief that you might survive, the trust that your surroundings won't kill you, the basic human ability to function when you know that the odds are grinding down to nothing. 2nd Platoon took the worst of it. They'd lost their platoon leader, Lieutenant David Haskell, on the 4th day. A sniper. Haskell had been a popular officer, smart, careful, the kind of leader who actually listened to his NCOs. He was checking a map at the base of a tree when the round hit him. He didn't die immediately. He lay there for 20 minutes, conscious, talking, while the medic tried to stop the bleeding from his neck. He died looking at Sergeant Briggs, mid-sentence, in the middle of saying his wife's name. After Haskell, command sent a replacement officer, 2nd Lieutenant Paul Vickers, fresh from OCS, 22 years old, 90 days of training and 0 days of combat. He lasted 6 days. A mine. He stepped on it, crossing a fire break that had already been swept. The mine had been buried deep, below the detection threshold. Vickers lost both legs below the knee. The explosion was so loud that the men nearby were temporarily deafened. They carried him out on a door ripped from a farmhouse. He was screaming the entire time. After Vickers, no replacement came. Briggs ran the platoon. He was 26, a carpenter from Pittsburgh, and he'd been in the Army since 1941. He was competent, tough, respected, but he wasn't an officer, didn't have the authority of one, and the men could see on his face every day that he was holding on by his fingernails. The replacements made it worse. As veterans fell, new men came in, green, untrained, terrified. They didn't know the sounds yet, which whistle meant mortar, which crack meant sniper, which rumble meant armor. They made mistakes. They moved when they should have been still. They froze when they should have moved. And they died at a higher rate than the veterans, which meant more replacements, which meant more green soldiers, which meant more deaths. A cycle that fed on itself. By the time Fox Company was pulled out of the Hurtgen in mid-November, 2nd Platoon had been rebuilt twice. Of the original 44 men who'd entered the forest, 11 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, or evacuated with what the Army called combat exhaustion, the clinical term for a mind that had absorbed more horror than it could process. The 11 survivors were not the same men who'd gone in. They were quieter, slower, detached. They didn't joke. They didn't complain. They ate, slept, cleaned their weapons, and stared at nothing. Medics recognized the signs. Chaplains tried to reach them. But there's a place men go inside themselves when the world becomes nothing but threat, and it's very hard to bring them back. They were given 5 days of rest, 5 days behind the line. Hot food, clean clothes, a roof. It wasn't enough. 5 months wouldn't have been enough, but it was all the Army could afford. The war didn't pause for broken men. Then the order came. Take the ridge east of their position. German fortifications, machine gun nests, a defended hilltop overlooking a river crossing that 3rd Army needed. Fox Company would lead the assault. 2nd Platoon would take the center. The morning of the attack was cold, low 30s, a raw, damp cold that went through wool and cotton and settled in the bones. Fog sat in the valleys, thick enough to hide the German positions, but not thick enough to hide the Americans crossing open ground. Captain Mercer briefed his platoon leaders at 0500. He was thorough, careful, honest about the risks. The approach to the ridge involved crossing roughly 400 yards of open terrain, a sloping field, partially frozen, with scattered clusters of dead brush that offered the illusion of cover, but not the reality. The German positions were at the top. Intelligence estimated 2 machine gun emplacements, possibly 3, with supporting infantry and at least 1 mortar team. The positions were dug in, fortified, and had clear fields of fire down the slope. It was, objectively, a terrible approach. Everyone in the briefing knew it. But the ridge had to be taken. The river crossing depended on it. The division timetable depended on the river crossing. And the Army's advance depended on the division timetable. Each piece connected to the next, a chain of necessity that started with strategic planning at Schaff and ended with 41 exhausted men being asked to walk into machine gun fire. Briggs brought the order back to 2nd Platoon. He didn't sugarcoat it. We cross the field, we take the ridge. It's going to be hot. Keep low, keep moving, don't stop for anything. 1st and 3rd platoons will be on our flanks. We're the center. We go straight up. The men listened. They didn't ask questions. They didn't complain. They just looked at him with those flat, empty eyes that veterans of the Hurtgen all shared. Private Tommy Farina was cleaning his rifle. He'd been doing it for 20 minutes. The rifle was already clean. But the repetitive motion was calming. Something to do with his hands. Farina had been in the platoon since Normandy. 6 months of continuous combat. He'd been hit twice. Shrapnel in the shoulder in July. A graze across his thigh in October. Neither wound was serious enough for evacuation. He kept fighting. He was one of the original 11. Corporal Pete Del Vecchio, Farina's squad leader, sat down next to him. You good? Farina didn't look up. Define good. Can you do this? Farina stopped cleaning. He looked at Del Vecchio. Can I walk across an open field into machine guns? Yeah, I can do that. Have I run out of reasons to? Also, yeah. Del Vecchio didn't have an answer for that. At 06:15, the barrage started. American artillery, softening the German positions. The shells screamed overhead and detonated on the ridge in bursts of black and orange. The ground shook. The sound was enormous, physical, a pressure against the chest. At 06:30, the barrage lifted. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. In that silence, every man in 2nd Platoon knew what came next. Briggs stood up. Let's go. They moved out. 1st Squad on the left, 2nd Squad center, 3rd Squad right. Standard assault formation, spread wide, moving fast. The fog was burning off now, revealing the field in pale gray light. The ground was frozen mud, uneven, treacherous. They made it about 100 yards before the Germans opened up. The first burst came from the left, a MG-42, that distinctive tearing sound, 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast the individual shots blurred into a continuous rip. The tracers cut across the field in a flat arc, green-white lines burning through the fog. Men dropped. 2 went down immediately in 1st Squad. 1 was hit, the other dove for cover instinctively. The rest of the platoon followed. Everyone went to ground, pressing into the frozen earth, making themselves as small as possible. Then the second gun opened up from the right, interlocking fire, just as Mercer had predicted. The 2 guns created a crossfire pattern that covered the entire width of the field. There was nowhere to hide. Every depression, every fold in the ground, every dead bush was being swept. A mortar round landed 30 yards behind them. Then another, closer. The Germans had the field zeroed. They'd been waiting. Briggs was screaming. Keep moving! Don't stop! Move forward! Some men tried. A few got up, ran a few steps, went down again. Others didn't try at all. They pressed their faces into the mud and stayed there. And then it happened. Private Tommy Farina, lying in the center of the field, raised his head and looked at Briggs. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the tracers cutting overhead. He calculated the distance. 300 yards of open ground, 2 machine guns, mortars dialed in. He did the math that every infantryman does in a moment like that, the math they don't teach at OCS, the math that happens in the animal part of the brain where survival instinct lives. And the math told him the answer was no. He said it out loud. No, Briggs heard him. Farina, get up. No, I'm not going up there. Nobody should be going up there. That's an order. Then it's a bad order. That ridge is a kill box, and you know it. The men around Farina heard the exchange, and something happened. Something commanders dread more than any enemy action. The refusal spread, not through argument or persuasion, through recognition. Every man on that field knew Farina was right. They'd known it since the briefing. They'd known it when they saw the field. They just hadn't been the first to say it. Within a minute, nobody in 2nd Platoon was moving. Not forward, not backward. They were simply down, faces in the mud, refusing. Briggs tried. He got up, ran forward 10 yards by himself, turned around. Nobody followed. He stood there in the open machine gun rounds cracking past him, alone, exposed, screaming at men who had decided, individually and collectively, that they were done. Corporal Del Vecchio pulled him down. Sarge, get down! You're going to get killed. They have to move. We have to take that ridge. Nobody's moving, Sarge. It's over. Captain Mercer saw the whole thing through his binoculars. 2nd Platoon, his center element, had stopped. 1st and 3rd platoons on the flanks were still moving, but without the center, the attack was unbalanced, vulnerable. He had maybe 2 minutes before the Germans figured out what was happening and shifted fire to the advancing flanks. He made a decision. He called the attack off, pulled everyone back, smoke rounds to cover the withdrawal. Fox Company retreated to the starting line. 2nd Platoon came back carrying 4 dead and 11 wounded. They'd been in the open for less than 15 minutes. The ridge was still in German hands. Mercer's report went to battalion. Battalion sent it to regiment. Regiment sent it to division. A platoon had refused to advance. in combat, under fire. This wasn't a quiet incident that could be managed at the company level. It was a systemic failure that demanded a response. The word went up through Third Army, and it reached Patton. General George S. Patton arrived at Fox Company's position 2 days later. He came in a jeep, wearing his trademark helmet and ivory-handled pistols, accompanied by his aide and 2 staff officers. He didn't announce the visit in advance. He just appeared. The men of Fox Company knew who he was the moment the jeep stopped. Every soldier in Europe knew Patton. They knew his reputation. The brilliance, the aggression, the temper, the slapping incident in Sicily, where he'd struck a shell-shocked soldier in a field hospital. That incident was on everyone's mind. A man who'd slapped a combat-exhausted soldier was now coming to deal with an entire platoon that had refused to fight. The men of 2nd Platoon expected punishment. They expected rage. Some expected to be arrested, court-martialed, maybe sent to a stockade for the rest of the war. A few, remembering the stories about the First World War, wondered if they'd be shot. Patton went to Mercer first. They spoke privately for 10 minutes. Then Patton asked to be taken to 2nd Platoon's position. The platoon was assembled in a bombed-out barn behind the line. 41 men, 30 now, after the casualties on the field. They stood in loose formation, dirty, exhausted, their eyes carrying that particular emptiness that comes from having seen too much and slept too little. Patton walked in and looked at them. He didn't speak immediately. He walked along the line, studying faces. He stopped in front of Farina. "You the one who said no?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Farina's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this question for 2 days. He'd rehearsed answers, explanations, justifications, appeals to logic and survival. But standing in front of Patton, all of that fell away. What came out was the truth. "Because I've been watching men die for 6 months, sir. Because that field was a death trap and everyone knew it. Because I've used up everything I had, and when the time came to go again, there was nothing left." Patton looked at him. Then he looked at the rest of the platoon. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled over a wooden crate, sat down on it, and took off his helmet. Without the helmet, without the stars and the legend, he looked like what he was, a 60-year-old man who'd been at war for most of his adult life. The lines on his face, the weight in his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't General Patton. He was just a tired soldier in a room full of tired soldiers. "Sit down," he said. The men hesitated. You don't sit in Patton's presence. You stand at attention and hope he doesn't notice you. "I said sit down. That's an order." They sat. On the ground, on broken beams, on ammunition crates. 30 men and 1 general in a ruined barn. Patton spoke. His voice was different from the one they'd heard in the newsreels. Quieter, rougher, without the theatrical edge. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you you're cowards. You're not cowards. Cowards don't make it to the Siegfried line. Cowards don't survive Omaha Beach or the Hurtgen Forest. Every man in this room has done things that most people in this country will never understand, and you've done them for months without stopping." He paused. The men were listening. Not the rigid, fearful attention of soldiers expecting punishment. Real listening. "I know what the Hurtgen did. I've read the reports. I've visited the hospitals. I've seen what comes out of that forest, and it's not the same as what goes in. You went in as soldiers. You came out as something else. Something that's been ground down so far there's nothing left to grind." He stood up and walked to the opening of the barn. Through it, the men could see the ridge, still in German hands, still bristling with positions they hadn't been able to take. But here's what you need to hear, and I need you to hear it clearly. What you did on that field, stopping, refusing, that can't happen. Not because I say so, not because the regulations say so, because of what it means. He turned back to face them. When one platoon stops, the company is exposed. When the company is exposed, the flanks collapse. When the flanks collapse, men in other platoons die. Men who were doing their jobs, men who were advancing, men who counted on you to be where you were supposed to be. Your 1st Platoon and 3rd Platoon were moving. They were out there in the same fire, crossing the same ground, and they were moving. And when you stopped, they had to stop too. They had to pull back. And that retreat cost time, and time costs lives. He let that sit. I know why you stopped. I understand it. In 1918, I was lying in a shell crater with a bullet in my leg, and every instinct in my body told me to stay down. Every animal part of me said, "Don't get up, don't move, the war can finish without you." I understand what it feels like when the body says no. I've been there. He looked at Farina. You said the field was a death trap. You were right. It was a terrible approach, and the casualties proved it. If I'd been your platoon leader, I would have argued for a different plan, but I wouldn't have stopped. And here's why. Not because I'm braver than you, because I've learned something in 40 years of soldiering that I wish I could hand you like a piece of ammunition. He paused again. The man who stops in the field doesn't save himself. He thinks he does, but he doesn't. He carries that stop for the rest of his life. Every morning, every night, every time he looks at himself, he sees the man who quit. And that weight is heavier than anything the Germans can put on you. I've seen it. Men who survived the war, but didn't survive the quitting. They came home and fell apart, not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't do. The barn was silent except for the distant thump of artillery. I'm not going to court-martial you. I'm not going to make an example of anyone. I'm not going to put this platoon in front of a board and let staff officers who've never heard a shot fired decide what should happen to men who fought for 6 months. He picked up his helmet and put it back on. The general was back. Here's what's going to happen. This platoon is going to get 3 days of rest. Hot food, clean bunks, showers. A medical team is going to evaluate every man here. Anyone who's genuinely unfit, combat exhaustion, whatever the doctors call it, gets pulled out. No shame. No mark on the record. You've earned the right to break without being punished for it. He looked down the line. But the men who are fit, the men who can still carry a rifle and put one foot in front of the other, you're going back. Not to that field. We're not repeating a bad plan. We're going to find a better approach to that ridge, and you're going to take it. Because that's the only way this ends. Not the war. I mean this. What happened on that field? The only way you put it behind you is to go forward. You stop here, and you're stopped forever. He walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. One more thing. That boy who said no. Farina. Farina's head came up. You were wrong to stop, but you were right about the field. A soldier who can see a bad plan is valuable. A soldier who refuses to fight is useless. The difference between those two things is how you say it. You bring it to your sergeant. Your sergeant brings it to the captain. The captain brings it to me. That's how an army works. You don't solve bad orders by quitting. You solve them by being loud enough, up the chain, that someone with stars on his collar hears you and fixes it. If the plan was wrong, that's my failure, not yours. Your job is to tell me. Then, whatever I decide, you go. He fixed Farina with a look that carried the weight of 2 world wars. Can you do that? Farina held his gaze. Yes, sir. Good. 3 days. Get some rest. Then we finish this. Patton left. 3 days later, Fox Company went back. The plan was different. Instead of a frontal assault across open ground, they came at the ridge from the northeast, using a tree line and a shallow ravine for cover. It added 6 hours to the timeline. Division wasn't happy about the delay. Patton overruled them. 2nd Platoon led the approach. Briggs was at the front. Farina was behind him. They moved through the ravine in pre-dawn darkness, silent, disciplined, focused. At 0540, they hit the German flank. The machine gun positions were oriented south and west toward the open field, the approach they'd tried before. From the northeast, the guns couldn't traverse fast enough. 2nd Platoon was inside the perimeter before the Germans fully understood what was happening. The fighting was close, intense, and brief. 45 Minutes. Room to room in the bunker complex. Grenades, rifles, bayonets. The kind of combat where you can see the face of the man you're fighting. By 0630, the ridge was taken. Fox Company's casualties. 4 killed, 9 wounded. A fraction of what the frontal assault would have cost. Farina survived. He cleared 2 bunker positions with his squad, captured 6 German soldiers, and was later awarded a Bronze Star for his actions on the ridge. The citation made no mention of what had happened on the field 3 days earlier. That incident existed nowhere in the official record. Patton had made sure of it. Briggs survived too. He received a battlefield commission and finished the war as a 2nd lieutenant. He stayed in the Army after the war, did 20 years, retired as a major. He never spoke about the day his platoon stopped. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to the men he served with later. It was a sealed room in his memory, and he kept it shut. Of the 30 men in 2nd Platoon that day in the barn, 22 made it to the end of the war. They went home to their lives, to jobs, to children who would never know what their fathers had done and what their fathers had refused to do. Patton never wrote about the incident in his diary. He never mentioned it in his letters to his wife. It was, for him, a routine leadership problem. Men broke. He assessed the situation. He made a decision. And the war went on. But what he did in that barn was anything but routine. He could have made an example. Court-martials, stockade time, dishonorable discharges. It would have sent a message to every unit in 3rd Army. Refuse to fight, and your life is over. That was the standard response, the one the manual prescribed, the one most generals would have chosen. Instead, he did something harder. He acknowledged the breaking without excusing it. He showed understanding without showing weakness. He gave them rest without giving them an escape. And then he sent them back. Not to the same slaughter, but to a fight they could win. That was Patton's genius. Not the tanks, not the speed, not the grand strategy. It was the understanding that an army is made of men, and men are not machines. They wear out. They break down. And when they do, you don't discard them. You repair them. You give them what they need. Rest, recognition, a better plan. And then you send them forward again. Because the war doesn't stop. And the only direction that leads anywhere is forward. Years later, Tommy Farina went home to Brooklyn. He got a job at the Navy Yard, married a girl from the neighborhood, and had 3 kids. He didn't talk about the war much. But when his oldest son asked him once what the worst moment was, Farina didn't describe the Hurtgen or Omaha Beach or the dozens of firefights in between. He said, "The worst moment was the day I stopped, and the best moment was the day I started again." Would you have punished 2nd Platoon or given them another chance? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about World War II that reveal what really happens when men reach the limit of what they can endure, make sure to subscribe.